Going down before we go up. What this project addresses is the ungrounded leading to disastrous results in elements of the New Age or alternative movement. When you build a skyscraper, the first thing the architect and the contractor does is assess the soil, the environment. And they spend the first often number of months, in some cases several years, going deep underground, piling deep pilings to anchor the projected pinnacle with deep foundation. There's a good reason for this. When you go down before you go up, you do not topple over. And one of the phenomena that I've observed in my, 40 years around hippies and channeling and different communities, whether it's Findhorn or Esalen, etc., is this tendency to rapidly climb without exploring the shadow, the depths. Now, when we rapidly build a skyscraper without foundation, the slightest breeze topples it over. But it doesn't just topple over the building, it crashes onto buildings and spaces nearby. Inhabitants of that building lose their lives. People on the ground can be crushed by falling debris. When a large structure collapses due to betrayal, due to trauma, due to ignorance, due to denial of there needing to be any shadow, any deep work, any foundation. When a large structure collapses, it causes damage, and it causes enormous waste. It takes a lot of energy to build a rapidly ascending vertical structure. So this is the awareness. So what's the premise? The premise is simply this. If you will go down before you go up, I remember Terence McKenna, as an aside, in one of his recordings, said that he decided to go around the world to prove that, spirituality and metaphysics was all bunk. And so he would go to an ashram and, do all the rituals and sweep to just prove that they were full of shit. And he went around and successfully did so until he came to psilocybin, until he found himself in the jungle with Stropharia cubensis. And there, along with DMT, which was the big opener for him, he found that there has got to be something. And so this was the one thing he tried to prove that was bunk, that he just could not get around the idea that none of it was real. And so he became an advocate of the use of certain specific, DMT is endogenous inside the brain, meaning we're all born with it. It's odd it's a Schedule I drug if it's innate in every human body, but that being the case, this became his interest. And I think in some ways that this is a healthy approach to start by testing and trying to pull apart and things. I remember as a young child, as soon as I'd get a toy, I would try and pull it all apart and test it in all different ways and see how it worked, and if I was lucky, get it back together again. So in this project, the goal is simply that regardless of your spiritual calling, of your spiritual path, that you take time to educate yourself about the pitfalls, about the betrayals, about what can go wrong. Like what went wrong with Rajneesh's vision of a superhuman race with 100,000 person city that would launch the new world, or the channel Lazarus, who I worked with extensively, or what went wrong with the Holy Hell community, if you watch that documentary. So what's going on with the psychics that won't take James Randi up on his $1 million bid? So here's my hypothesis, and this is the basis of this project. My hypothesis is there is a lot out there that we don't know, and there's a lot out there that we don't know that we don't know. My hypothesis is that 99.9% of all there is to know, we don't know, and we don't know that we don't know it. That reality is much bigger than we can comprehend through 5 senses. If you think of the instrumentation of a scientist, we have 5 instruments. And if energy comes to us within those very narrow bandwidths in a way that these instruments can pick up and make sense of in a brain that tunes out 50% of what we sensorily pick up, then we know something about that, or we can at least develop hypotheses. But the idea that from those 5 senses we would know, even 1/10 of 1% of the whole known universe, or perhaps multiverse, or perhaps all of the dimensions that we do not have senses to perceive. In a sense, a sense is a dimension, the dimension of smell. If it shows up in that dimension, we see it. But what if it showed up in the dimension of L? And there is a device called an L reader that would read that dimension of L. We just don't have it. So there's this whole dimension with all kinds of interesting dynamics going on in that dimension called the dimension of L. We just need an L reader to be able to look into it. Now, microscopes allowed us to move beyond our ignorance around germs. Louis Pasteur, the origin of the word to pasteurize, to kill the germs, Louis Pasteur hypothesized that doctors were killing patients. And he hypothesized that the reason was there must be some organism called a germ that are on doctors' hands that are not being washed and doctors' tools that are not being sterilized. And he was scoffed at again and again by the medical community that there could be anything that the eye couldn't see. Then the microscope comes along, suddenly there's a new world. So if we know that 99.9% of what's out there to know is currently unknown, and that any human being who thinks that they know all of it deserves to be locked up. It's insane to have that level of hubris that one species, a monkey out of the trees 100,000 years ago, would have the answer to everything in the entire universe in less than 100,000 years. That's pretty bold assuming. So what's the purpose then? It is not to discourage the ashrams, the channeling, the psychics, the whatever, and this, that, and the other. But it is to go in with an informed discernment. So if you will take 20 hours of your life as a one-time investment to go down, to look beneath, to look into the shadow, to go into the ground, my hope is that the things that you choose will be more informed, more sophisticated, more illuminated, that you have more diversity. Another thing that can often happen, which top investors guide novices around, is putting all your eggs in one basket. You often get a more diversified approach if you can, maybe contemplate some of the better channelers' input from this angle, maybe contemplate some of the Buddhist teachings, some of the Christian teachings, some of what you receive in your meditation, some of what you extrapolate from some of the best books, that you can develop 360-degree vision by understanding the dark side of every object, every action, every impact, and the light side of every action, every impact. There is a dark side and a light side. The fact that I don't die today means that worms in my garden, where I intend to be buried, are being deprived of food. as are my roses. So there is consequence. There is 360-degree vision to be had. And this project aims to minimize the amount of betrayal, crisis, etc., around the tendency of trauma-based individuals. We're a very high trauma-based culture. And trauma-based individuals tend to form patterns with authority figures, with gurus, with teachers, etc., that replicate the abusive dynamic with their families. And we are a trauma-ignorant culture. So it tends to be some of the most vulnerable people in our culture and world that form the most unhealthy relationships with the most unhealthy teachers, authorities, etc. And it's my hypothesis that if these individuals, if friends of these individuals, if you will take the time to see the dark side while not ignoring the light side, looking at the full picture. Something wonderful about living in an ashram and not having the beeps of the adrenaline addiction of a cell phone. And there's something wonderful about having a cell phone and being able to talk with a lover around the world. And there's something wonderful about being aware of the cell phone radiation that makes my hands tingle every time I hold a Wi-Fi device for more than a few minutes. We need to have 360 vision. And we need to understand this balance, that there's an upside and a downside, and that to have a really sustainable relationship, we must be aware of, we must be at peace with both. So how can you participate? Number one, you can tell your story. Number two, you can make a video. Number three, you can submit a video for this collection. Number four, you can take the time to study and be aware of the dark side. And Debbie Ford's The Dark Side of the Light Chasers, of the dark side. And in doing so, hopefully build a more stable and secure, sustainable path forward with more vision, more awareness, and thus more attunement and more success in the work that you wish to do in the world.